Coming up on Theater Talk.
Has there been a philosophy, an ethos, a core idea behind the acting company?
Well, I think it's one to develop American classical actors, because we do the classics for the most part, to give actors a chance to really develop like they do in England, not just get out of school and go do a television show.
Theater Talk is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation. From New York City, this is Theater Talk. I'm Susan Haskins.
And I'm Michael Riedel of the New York Post. Now, Susan, I went to an interesting writers' event here in New York called Speakeasy. And it's 5 writers who get up, and they have 15 minutes in which to speak without notes about any subject they want to talk about. But it's often about the book that they have just written. And I was very impressed by our guest, Mr. Ben Yagoda, fine writer and journalist. And he spoke about his new book called The B-Side, The Death of Tin Pan Alley and the Rebirth of the Great American Song. And I love the Great American Songbook, and I love popular music, and I was fascinated by the story that Ben tells in this book. So welcome to Theater Talk, Ben.
Thank you so much.
I know we usually talk about Broadway and the theater here, but we're making an exception just for you.
Well, there's a lot of crossover.
Absolutely.
Sure.
All right, so the death of Tin Pan Alley. When does that happen, and what causes it? What causes the death of what we consider the Great American Songbook?
Well, to pick a date, not at random, but 1950, the great writer Alec Wilder wrote a book called American Popular Song. That was the classic book, and he was a composer, musician, a wonderful writer himself. And the book came out in the 70s, but he chose 1950 as the cutoff. He included some songs written after that, but only writers who were active as of 1950. And someone interviewed him and said, why? And his answer was, after that, the amateurs took over. That's hyperbole, and there's no precise date, but this notion, as you mentioned, the Great American Songbook, the songs of Gershwin and Berlin, Kern, Rodgers, et cetera, et cetera. When you look back, 90+% of the songs that are considered Great American Songbook songs were written between the 20s and the 50s. Already in the late 40s, people were sort of bemoaning the state of popular song. Frank Sinatra was complaining he couldn't get good material, except from Broadway.
Right.
That was the one place where it was coming from. Billy Eckstine was complaining. Variety was calling the current songs tripe. No one really realized that something was ending. They thought that, well, next year it's going to turn around. And they kept thinking that until round about 1956 when Elvis happened. And then after that, the deluge onto the Beatles. So looking back, we can say, well, you know, round about 1950, late 40s, early 50s, it was coming to an end. At the time, they didn't realize that.
Right. But now, the villain, if you will, of your book is not rock and roll or Elvis or the Beatles, but Mitch Miller and the Mitch Miller Singers. Because he comes in and he cheapens the whole idea of popular song, does he not? Well,
that's what Frank Sinatra said, and Tony Bennett, who's a kinder man, perhaps, has implied it, and Rosemary Clooney complained about Mitch Miller. And the thing about Mitch Miller is he's known now most, if at all, for Sing Along with Mitch, these television albums. He'd have a male chorus and sing Yellow Rose of Texas.
Well, he was cheapening the popular song on that show.
Well, it could be said. I mean, the thing about that show, which only started in the 60s, was that, or I think 1960, he went way, way, way back before Great American Songbook appeared. It was like turn-of-the-century songs, Sidewalks of New York, these kind of simpler songs that the Cole Porter, Rodgers, and Hart supplanted. But before Sing Along with Mitch, it's not that well known. Mitch Miller, throughout the entire decade of the 50s, was the most popular person in the popular music business. He was the head of popular music for Columbia Records, the biggest record company. He knew music. He was no Philistine. He came out of classical music. He was a top oboist and went over to the record business. He's accused of cheapening it, going for highly produced songs like
a novelty song.
Novelty song, like Come On to My House by Rosemary Clooney. She was presented with that. People watching may not know what it is, but it's a kind of pidgin Armenian nonsense song. Come on to my house, we'll have candy, and it's you know, a catchy little ditty. Rosemary Clooney was a devotee, former big band singer, devotee of great songs. Said to Mitch Miller, you know, I don't really think I want to sing this, and he said, I think you will, because if not, you're out of a job. You're under contract, so you've got to sing it. And she sang it. It was a #1 hit.
Yeah.
That was very clever and smart, that number.
Sure.
But when it came to the television program, for which someone of my generation knew him best, he had a big crowd of smiling, very bland-looking white people, except for Leslie Uggam,
Right.
singing these songs, taking all edge and meaning out of them, just hour after hour on television. It was the kind of thing that then the rock and roll era that was about to come in, you know, the smart rock and roll era begun by the Beatles, would rebel against.
Sure. It was the bland leading the bland.
Yeah, the bland leading the bland.
I mean, I'm not an expert on the sing-along with Mitch. My understanding is there was no even harmony. It was all just unison.
Yes, that's right.
Everyone's singing the same
Like the
note.
Ray Conniff singers.
About
at least
as dull as it
It was
could
about,
be.
it made Lawrence Welk look cutting edge. and
But
powerful.
what was Mitch like as a person? And I mean, from what he said, you just said what he said to Rosie Clooney. I mean, he was the dominant figure in the music business at that time, and you did not cross him, correct?
Right. I mean, I didn't come across anything indicating that he was vindictive at all. In fact, you know, when he came to Columbia in 1950, Frank Sinatra was on the label, and it was the low point of Sinatra's career.
Right.
His voice was in poor shape, his personal life was in bad shape, his movie career was in bad shape, and Mitch Miller tried desperately to get him a hit. Nothing really worked. The biggest hit in those years for Sinatra, oddly enough, was a cover version of the folk song Goodnight Irene by Leadbelly, which went to #5. That was the high point. But he did, you know, really terrible novelty songs, most famously, most egregiously, Mama Will Bark, a duet with Dagmar and some dogs.
Yes.
Columbia didn't renew his contract and dropped him. He went on to Capitol, and his career had a great rebirth. And
Then we had the Nelson Riddle and that whole...
and Great American Songbook songs. But ever since, Sinatra blamed Mitch Miller. He said, Miller forced me into this track, and Miller wouldn't take anything from anybody. He said, no, it's not true. Sinatra had final approval on all his material, and that is true. Sinatra willingly agreed to do all the stuff. So Miller, you know, he had a way he wanted to do things. He was sort of the first record producer in the modern sense of the word. There were no producers beforehand. There was an A&R man who signed the acts and hired the musicians and got the properties, and an engineer would twirl the buttons. Miller got there with sound effects, production values, strange instrumentation, harpsichords, French horns, French horn imitating the cry of the wild goose in a song by the same name. There was another big hit by Terry Gilkyson. And was sort of the leading figure in the transition from the song being the most important thing to the record being the most important thing.
And what was it, why was Mitch Miller, having been a classically trained musician, a man with taste, attracted to these novelty songs? How did he stumble onto this concept of the novelty song? The songs that made fun of ethnicities back then.
Right. Well, you know, it's a good question. I don't know. Before Columbia, his first job, his friend John Hammond hired him to Mercury Records, and they had a singer named Frankie Lane. Yeah. And Miller put him together with a property called Mule Train. And for the Mule Train, he had the idea, let's make the sound of the whip. And he cracked 2 blocks together, and I guess the light bulb went off and said, I can make sound effects. And he went with that. And, you know, people said at the time, and probably correctly, that he didn't consider popular music great music, that classical music was the only music that was worthwhile. Now, you and I probably think that it can be great popular music. I certainly do. He didn't feel that way. So he saw it as a product, a commodity. He wanted to make records that would appeal to people and that people would buy, and he succeeded.
Do you have any sense of why, in America at this time, popular culture responded in such a big way to this, what some people, Frank Sinatra, would consider dreck?
Right. Well, you know, the word bland we used before, I think that's a key to it, and not to paint with too broad a brush, but the war was over, the Depression was over, the servicemen had come back, they were having kids, sitting around the television. Mitch Miller hadn't come on yet, but there was Lawrence Welk and there was Perry Como.
Yeah.
And the bland, sentimental, novelty stuff was what people appealed to people. They didn't want to be challenged. My feeling about the key to the Great American Songbook period was the relationship to jazz. Jazz came along in the 20s just as these songs were, and the composers Porter and Arlen and Gershwin understood jazz. They would write a song, and then jazz artists like Billie Holiday or Benny Goodman, Teddy Wilson would do great things with it. That wonderful organic sense of things kind of ended after the war. The big bands broke up. Bebop came in, which was great, but it was more challenging, wasn't based on songs, wasn't based on dancing. People didn't want to go out anymore, and there was just a general sense of and a desire for kind of less challenging.
And lyrically too, because the Great American Songbook has real poetic lyrics that deal with loneliness and sadness and longing
and wonderfully witty things by Cole Porter and Lorenz Hart. I get no kick from champagne.
And a sophistication that is gone with some of these novelty songs. Come out of my house.
Out the window. But, as I indicated earlier, the only place where that quality of song was being produced was Broadway.
Yeah.
And all the best songwriters, some of whom had been out in Hollywood, came back. So Julie Stein came back. Frank Lesser came back. Rodgers and Hammerstein had never gone away. Irving Berlin came back in the post-war period and did Annie Get Your Gun. Cole Porter did Kiss Me Kate.
We do have John Kander and Fred Ebb and Stephen Sondheim them beginning too, as well as young men.
And the young writers coming up in the 50s Hollywood had stopped making musicals. The Tin Pan Alley music business was more in this novelty number, jingly type stuff. So the young writers, the people you mentioned, Jerry Bach, Sheldon Harnick, Charles Strauss, they gravitated toward Broadway. And there was a good long run up until, through the early to mid-'60s when great songs were coming out of Broadway shows still.
Right. And then we began, of course, with the death of Tin Pan Alley, but when does the rebirth of the Great American Song? Does that happen when Sinatra goes to Columbia and
goes to Capitol? Yeah, there's two rebirths. So it's like two rebirths for the price of one. And one is, oddly enough, interestingly enough, fortunately, in that same period when it was really clear that this one tradition was ending, late 50s. All of a sudden there was a recognition that there was a Great American Songbook. So Sinatra. All his albums at Capitol were heavily based on those older songs. Ella Fitzgerald did the songs she called the songbooks, the Gershwin songbook, the Irving Berlin songbook, etc. Mel Torme, Sarah Vaughan, all sorts of people were coming out in the late 50s, early 60s with these, and Bennett all the way, Tony Bennett all the way kept doing it. The second rebirth is after the explosion of rock, almost literally an explosion, it sounded like one. That was, the huge thing in the 50s called the big beat, and we're still dealing with it today. But after a few years, round about 1960, there was a space for a more quiet song, a more subtle, melodic song.
Singer-songwriter era we're beginning to get into?
Leading into the singer-songwriter, but even before then, people like Carole King, Will You Love Me Tomorrow, and Burt Bacharach doing some amazing things. And not only in New York, so Willie Nelson was writing Crazy down in Nashville, and Brian Wilson out in California, with some wonderful songs, Caroline.
Well, and I think those very introspective, quite beautiful songs, the Bacharach David, Dionne Warwick songs of the early 60s, the Walk-on-Bys, the Anyone Who Had a Heart, those are very much, they're innovative, but they're in the tradition of the American Songbook with reflective, thoughtful, deeper kinds of lyrics.
They really are, and I guess of that period, Bacharach and Leonard McCartney alone had the broader musical palette, so really sophisticated stuff.
The book is called The B-Side, The Death of Tin Pan Alley and the Rebirth of the Great American Song by Ben Yagoda. A great book for anyone who's interested in music, songwriting, and American popular culture. Thank you for being our guest tonight on Theater Talk.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Now, Susan, one of the most important theater institutions in this town is the Acting Company, founded in 1972, and it has been responsible for some of the great careers here in New York. Kevin Kline, Patti LuPone, Harriet Harris, Francis Conroy. We are joined tonight by the founder of the Acting Company, my good friend, Margot Harley, who after 43 years is stepping down as the head of this important theatrical institution.
Yes.
Wow. I mean, don't you want another 43 years at it, Margot? Aren't you having the time of your life?
Well, I am, and I probably would like a few more years, but I think, I think I might have died behind that desk if someone hadn't said, maybe it's time for the younger generation to take over.
To take over. Now, you founded it with the great John Houseman, who was a great, great friend of yours. Can you take us back to what was the idea for the Acting Company? I mean, you were sitting around one night saying, hey, we need something to do.
Well, we had this fabulous first class. I mean, they were the first
at Juilliard.
At Juilliard.
Right.
They had started in 1968. It was now beginning of 1972, probably, or the end of 1971, maybe. And Mel Gusso.
And we should say Mel was the drama critic.
He was the drama critic for the New York Times, and he came to see them at Juilliard, and he went bananas. He thought they were just extraordinary.
This was Kevin and Patti.
Kevin and Patti and Mary Lou Rosado and David Stiers and Sam Chucha. It was a wonderful, enormously talented group of actors. There were 17 of them. We started with 30, and we ended up with 17. That's another story. And so it occurred to John and I that perhaps, as good as they weren't as good as they could be, and that if we kept them together as a company and gave them more performing experience, they'd really be great. And John had a friend at Saratoga and at the Performing Arts Center, and we got them to agree to turn the movie theater into it had been a theater, back into a theater, and to have us. And we got the Ford Foundation and the Mellons and the Rockefeller Foundations to give us some money, and we decided to keep them together. And we knew that we had to make a touring company because nobody was going to come to New York for any length of time and see a bunch of young actors playing.
You had to go out to the country.
We had to go out. And anyway, touring is probably the best experience for an actor, the best way to develop your chops.
Why?
Actors. Oh, because you have to play one night in this theater that's 300 seats, the next night in this theater that's 2,000 seats, and to a different kind of audience every night. And you can keep playing the same show over and over again. And so you really, which is rare, unless you hit a hit Broadway show,
Right. So
you get a lot of experience that way, and you play more than one show at a time. Hal Prince used to said once that if he saw the Acting Company on someone's resume, he would trust that they could do anything. Because if you can tour like we tour, you can do anything.
And one night you're going to have an audience that's in love with the Shakespeare production. The next night they may be Shriners who came from a boozy bar and they're out of control.
I remember a performance I went to in Brooklyn in which there were more actors on stage than there were in the house. And it was The Hostage, and they were coming in from outside the theater, down the aisles. They took one look and burst into hysterical laughter. I mean, it was unbelievable. I think 4 people in the audience, and they were 17.
Now, were you ever an actress?
Yes, but very briefly. I was a dancer for many years. I was a very good dancer. I was not a very good actor, I don't think. So
Did you realize that early on that it was?
Yeah, I realized I wasn't. I went to Lambda. I went to the London Academy of Music and Drama. I wasn't very good. I had a Fulbright, but I don't know why I got it. And I thought I wasn't really great. And I had been a really good dancer. So I went back to dancing briefly, and then I gave the whole thing up.
And then you decided directing or
No,
administrating?
then I didn't know what to do with myself. And I had followed someone I was in love with to San Francisco. I was in a show. I was in Milk and Honey.
Yes, I forgot that. Jerry Herman's first. Yeah.
And it ended in San Francisco. The tour ended, and I just stayed because I was madly in love with somebody who had been in the show with me. I didn't quite know what to do with myself, and I met a guy at a cocktail party who worked for KQED, which is the equivalent of 13.
Right.
And he offered me a job as a producer. And it was crazy because it was called World Press, and all the papers were about a month and a half late. So all the news was very late.
Coming from all the papers around the world.
All the world. It was a silly program, really silly. And I did that, though, for a couple of years.
How did John Houseman come into your life?
Well, because when I went back to New York, I went to work for Channel 13. but not as a producer. They didn't have a job. I was in charge of the Friends of Channel 13.
Oh, my goodness.
Wow.
And that's how I learned to fundraise.
Yeah.
And there was somebody on the Friends of Channel 13 who knew that I wasn't really happy there and I wanted to go back to the theater somehow. She told me that John Houseman was starting a drama school at Juilliard, a drama department, and she bugged me. And I thought, what am I going to do there? He bugged me, and I finally sent him my resume, which must have got there by carrier pigeon, because within minutes he called me. I went to meet him, and he kept me waiting, which is he was never late, so this was really unusual. I didn't know that at the time, and I got fed up, and I decided it was ridiculous, and I was going to go back to work. And I was going down the stairs, and he was coming up, and we bumped stomachs, and I obviously turned around and went up. And I spent about 8 minutes talking to him, and he hired me.
Really?
Just hired me as the administrator of the drama division on the spot. But he did that. He was very quick. He sized people up. He was such a smart man. He sized people up very quickly and could figure out. None of these long interviews. In my office now, they interview for hours. I can't think what they're doing. I can size somebody up in about 10 minutes.
Was he that way with the actors who were auditioning too? Could he see there's Kevin Kline,
Yes.
unformed Kevin Kline, and boom, I know
he could see talent like this, and nothing took very long with him. He was a wonderful editor of all kinds. He was a great artistic director. He could see exactly what was wrong with something. I mean, immediately, and he could tell you how to fix it. But he wasn't either, forgive me, John, he wasn't either a great actor or a great director, but he was a great producer.
But he becomes an actor.
Oh, he did. The first acting job he had was The Paper Chase.
Yeah. He was so brilliant in The Paper Chase. But when he was playing himself, though,
He was playing a part of himself.
Right.
Which
was the teacher.
Yes. Well, yes.
Yeah.
That person, which he wasn't that sort of formidable person, really. That was an act that he put on in his own life as well, But he was really a pussycat, in my opinion. I loved him. He was great.
He wrote some very, very good books. To your mind, what is his best book?
The first one.
Which is
Run Through, and it's about the 30s, really. It's about that period of time, the Mercury Theater, his time with Orson, who he always said was the only genius he ever knew, even though they broke up badly. Yeah. It was about the Cradle Will Rock. It was all about that period of time. The second was okay. Some of it was about Hollywood, because he went to Hollywood and made some movies, some really good movies. Yeah. And the third one was terrible, which is too bad, because it was about the acting company. But he took notes every day. And the third book, he just copied his notes. I mean, he didn't really think about it. It's too bad.
Has there been a philosophy, an ethos, a core idea behind the acting company?
Well, I think it's one to develop American classical actors, because we do the classics for the most part, to give actors a chance to really develop like they do in England, not just get out of school and go do a television show or make a movie or just do a short run somewhere. And also to take theater to places around the country. It was a kind of dual thing. And to take, it came out of the idea, but it was very important to us to take theater to small towns all across this country that didn't have professional theater. When we started, there were no theaters anywhere. I mean, there were very few, 5 or 6 maybe across this country. So we were the only theater that people got. I mean, there had been theater prior to that. I mean, when my father, who'd be 150 now probably, lived in Mansfield, Ohio, I mean, the theater.
Yeah, they had vaudeville theaters.
They had, Pavlova came. I mean, everybody toured.
Right. Sarah Bernhardt would, and she was at war with the Schuberts, who would freeze her out of the theater, and she would play tents or the sides of hills in towns.
People really toured. I mean, great actors toured. Yeah. But they don't do that anymore. So we were the only game in town for many, many, many years. And we still are the only game in a lot of small cities.
Right. And the idea has always been to play small cities, small towns. Not Chicago. They've got enough theater.
They've got enough theater.
Yeah, and was that your and John's idea?
Yes, that was. I mean, I think that was the logical thing to happen with it, but it was also the idea behind it.
All right, and last question for you, since we're a nonprofit, what's the secret to fundraising? You've been a fundraiser most of your life, and everyone says, "Oh, they hate it," but you are clearly very good at it.
You have to be passionate about what you're trying to fundraise for. You have to be dogged, and you have to get, well, to do anything for which you have to fundraise, you have to be a gambler. You just have to gamble that you're going to get the money,
Right.
you know, because we go into every year without any money at all.
But you've
and
got
we
the
have to
season
gamble
planned.
that we're going to raise a couple of $1 million in the course of the year.
seat of your pants.
Right.
Was
It's
John a
gonna
good?
He was a good fundraiser because he, you know, people knew him and he knew everybody. But I remember the day he came into the office and said, I can't go anywhere with my hat in my hand again. I just can't ask another person for another penny.
Well, I know that feeling.
And have you reached that point in your career?
Not quite, but almost.
All right.
Well, that's an interesting note, Michael, because this is the end of our Theater Talk season.
Yeah, this is it. We are off for the summer. You are our last guest on Theater Talk this season, but we will be back if we raise the money.
Yes, gambling.
We'll be back
Gambling that we can get back.
in October if we raise the money. But we'll get a few more pointers from Margot Harley. 43 years with the acting company, one of the great theatrical institutions here in New York, and very important, as we've learned tonight, to the country. Thank you for being our guest.
Thank you for having me.
Our thanks to the Friends of Theater Talk for their significant contribution to this production. Theater Talk is made possible in part by the Frederick Loewe Foundation, the CORY and Bob Donnelly Charitable Fund, the Noel Coward Foundation, Carrie J. Fries, the Dorothy Strelson Foundation, plus public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, and the New York State Council on the Arts, a state agency.
We welcome your questions or comments for Theater Talk. Thank you and good night.